Scores for execution, 6, 5 1/2. Five and 1/2, 6 1/2. Scores for synchronization, 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 5, 4 1/2, 4 1/2. Lauren and Aaron, 401C 2.0. Scores for execution, 7, 7, 7, 6. Scores for synchronization, 8 1/2, 8, 8, 8, 8. Beginning our second round, Crystal and Noah, 401B 2.0. Scores for execution, 7, 7 1/2, 5 1/2, 6. Scores for synchronization, 6 1/2, 6 1/2, 6, 5 1/2, 5 1/2. Nikki and Logan, one moment, please. Nikki and Logan, thank you for your patience. Nikki and Logan, 301B 2.0. Scores for execution, 5, 5, 5, 6 1/2. Scores for synchronization, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 6 1/2, 6, 5. Haley and Andrew, 5132D 2.0. Scores for execution, 6, 6, 6 1/2, 7. Scores for synchronization, 6 1/2, 6 1/2, 6 1/2, 6 1/2, 6 1/2. William and Caitlin, 301B 2.0. Scores for execution, 7, 7, 4 1/2, 6. Scores for synchronization, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 6, 5, 5 1/2. Ron and Gabby, 5132D 2.0. Scores for execution, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 6 1/2, 6. Scores for synchronization, 5, 4 1/2, 5, 4 1/2, 4 1/2. Abby and Jordan, 301B 2.0. Scores for execution, 7, 7, 6 1/2, 7 1/2. Scores for synchronization, 7 1/2, 7, 7, 7, 6 1/2. Mackenzie and Devin, 401B 2.0. Scores for execution, 6 1/2, 6 1/2, 6 1/2, 7. Scores for synchronization, 7 1/2, 6 1/2, 7 1/2, 7, 7. Crystal and Tom, 101B 2.0. Scores for execution, 6 1/2, 6, 7. Execution judge 4, 6 1/2. Scores for synchronization, 5 1/2, 6, 6, 6, 6. Jacob and Emily, 103B 2.0. Scores for execution, 7, 7, 7, 6 1/2. Scores for synchronization, 6 1/2, 6 1/2, 6 1/2, 7, 7. Jake and Ivy, 5233D 2.0. Scores for execution, 7, 6, 6, 6 1/2. Scores for synchronization, 5 1/2, 6, 6, 6, 6. Reed and Catherine, 403B 2.0. Scores for execution, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 6 1/2, 7. Scores for synchronization, 5, 5, 5 1/2, 5, 5 1/2. Casey and Allison, 401B 2.0. Scores for execution, 7 1/2, 6 1/2, 7 1/2, 7 1/2. Scores for synchronization, 8, 7 1/2, 7 1/2, 7 1/2, 7 1/2. Caitlin and Tom, 403B 2.0. Scores for execution, 6 1/2, 6, 6, 7 1/2. Scores for synchronization, 6 1/2, 6 1/2, 7 1/2, 7 1/2, 7. Lauren and Aaron, 201B 2.0. Scores for execution, 7 1/2, 7 1/2, 7, 6 1/2. Scores for synchronization, 7, 7, 7, 7, 8. Beginning our third round, Crystal and Noah, 205C 2.8. Scores for execution, 4, 4 1/2, 5 1/2, 5 1/2. Scores for synchronization, 4, 4, 4 1/2, 5, 4 1/2. Nikki and Logan, 107C 2.8. Scores for execution, 4 1/2, 5 1/2, 5, 4 1/2. Scores for synchronization, 5, 5 1/2, 5, 4 1/2, 4 1/2. Haley and Andrew, 107C 2.8. Scores for execution, 3 1/2, 3 1/2, 4 1/2, 4 1/2. Scores for synchronization, 4, 4, 5 1/2, 4, 5. William and Caitlin, 205C 2.8. Scores for execution, 4, 4, 4, 4. Scores for synchronization, 3, 2 1/2, 4, 3, 3 1/2. Ron and Gabby, 105B 2.7. Ron and Gabby, 105B. And 305B. Scores for execution, 6, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 7 1/2. Scores for synchronization, 5, 6, 6, 5 1/2, 6 1/2. Abby and Jordan, 51, 52B, 3.0. Scores for execution, 6 1/2, 6 1/2, 7 1/2, 8. Scores for synchronization, 6, 6 1/2, 6 1/2, 6 1/2, 7. Mackenzie and Devin, 205C, 2.8. Scores for execution, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 4, 4 1/2. Scores for synchronization, 4, 4, 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 4 1/2. Crystal and Tom, 205C, 2.8. Scores for execution, 5 1/2, 5, 4, 5. Scores for synchronization, 3 1/2, 4, 4, 4, 4. Jacob and Emily, 305B, 3.0. Scores for execution, 4 1/2, 4, 4 1/2, 4 1/2. Scores for synchronization, 4, 4, 3 1/2, 4, 4 1/2. Jake and Ivy, 205C, 2.8. Scores for execution, 6 1/2, 6, 5 1/2, 5. Scores for synchronization, 6, 5 1/2, 5, 5 1/2, 5 1/2. Reed and Catherine, 205C, 2.8. Scores for execution, 5, 5 1/2, 5, 5 1/2. Scores for synchronization, 6, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 6. Casey and Allison, 205C, 2.8. Scores for execution, 4, 4, 5 1/2, 6. Scores for synchronization, 5 1/2, 4 1/2, 5, 5 1/2, 5. Caitlin and Tom, 205C, 2.8. Scores for execution, 4 1/2, 4, 4 1/2, 5. Scores for synchronization, 4, 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 5, 4 1/2. Lauren, hold 1 minute, please. Lauren and Aaron, 305B, 3.0. Scores for execution, 7, 7, 4, 4. Scores for synchronization, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 4, 5 1/2, 5. Beginning round 4, Crystal and Noah, 305C, 2.8. Scores for execution, 2 1/2, 3, 3 1/2, 4. Scores for synchronization, 3, 2 1/2, 3, 3 1/2, 2 1/2. Nikki and Logan, 5152B, 3.0. Scores for execution, 5, 4, 6, 5 1/2. Scores for synchronization, 4 1/2, 4, 5, 4, 5. Haley and Andrew, 305C, 2.8. Scores for execution, 3 1/2, 4, 4, 4. Scores for synchronization, 3 1/2, 4, 4 1/2, 3 1/2, 4 1/2. William and Caitlin, 107C, 2.8. Incorrect dive. Ron and Gabby, 107C, 2.8. Scores for execution, 4, 5, 4 and 1/2, 4 and 1/2. Scores for synchronization, 4, 5, 5, 3 and 1/2, 4. Abby and Jordan, 405B, 3.0. Scores for execution, 8, 7, 7 and 1/2, 8. Scores for synchronization, 7 and 1/2, 8, 7 and 1/2, 8, 8 and 1/2. Mackenzie and Devin, 305C, 2.8.
Execution. 5, 4 and 1/2, 3, 4. Synchronization. 4, 3 and 1/2, 3 and 1/2, 3 and 1/2, 2 and 1/2. Crystal, Tom, 305C, 2.8. Execution. 3 and 1/2, 3, 4, 3 and 1/2. Synchro. 3, 3, 2 and 1/2, 3, 3. Jacob, Emily, 205B, 3.0. Execution. 5 and 1/2, 5, 5, 5. Synchro. 5, 5, 5 and 1/2, 5 and 1/2, 4 and 1/2. Jake, Ivy, 107C, 2.8. Execution. 2 and 1/2, 2 and 1/2, 4 and 1/2, 4 and 1/2. Synchronization. 3, 3 and 1/2, 3 and 1/2, 4, 4. Reed, Catherine, 5235D, 2.8. Execution. 3 and 1/2. 4. 4 and 1/2. 5. Synchronization. 4. 4. 4 and 1/2. 4 and 1/2. 4. Casey, Allison, 305C, 2.8. Execution. 4 and 1/2. 5 and 1/2. 5. 5. Synchronization. 4 and 1/2. 4. 5 and 1/2. 5. 4. Caitlin, Tom, 5235D, 2.8. Execution. 4. 4 and 1/2. 3 and 1/2. 4. Synchronization. 4. 4 and 1/2. 4 and 1/2. 4 and 1/2. 3 and 1/2. Lauren, Aaron, 107B, 3.1. Execution. 6, 7, 7 and 1/2, 7. Synchronization. 6 and 1/2, 7, 7. 6 and 1/2, 6. Crystal, 1 second. Crystal, Noah, 5235D, 2.8. Execution. 4 and 1/2, 5. 3 and 1/2, 5 and 1/2. Synchronization. 4 and 1/2, 4 and 1/2, 5. 4 and 1/2, 4. Nikki, Logan, 405C, 2.7. Execution. 5, 5, 5 and 1/2, 6. Synchronization. 5, 5, 5 and 1/2, 5 and 1/2, 6 and 1/2. Haley, Andrew, 205C, 2.8. Execution. 3 and 1/2, 4. 6 and 1/2, 6. Synchronization. 4, 4. 4 and 1/2, 5. 4 and 1/2. William, Caitlin, 5235D, 2.8.
Will all 14-18 girls 3-meter finalists please report behind the platforms for introductions? Again, all 14-18 girls 3-meter finalists, please report behind the platforms for introductions. Thank you.
Execution, 5, 5 and 1/2, 4 and 1/2, 5. Synchronization, 4, 4 and 1/2, 5, 4, 4 and 1/2. Ron, Gabby, 205B, 3.0. Execution, 3, 3 and 1/2, 6 and 1/2, 7 and 1/2. Synchronization, 3 and 1/2, 3 and 1/2, 4, 5, 5. Abby, Jordan, 205B, 3.0. Execution, 7 and 1/2, 7 and 1/2, 7 and 1/2, 7 and 1/2. Synchronization, 6 and 1/2, 7, 7, 7, 7 and 1/2. Mackenzie, Devin, 5335D, 2.9. Execution, 1, 1 and 1/2, 3, 4 and 1/2. Synchronization, 2, 1, 1 and 1/2, 2 and 1/2, 1 and 1/2. Crystal, Tom, 5235D, 2.8. Execution, 5, 5 and 1/2, 4, 5. Synchronization, 5, 4 and 1/2, 4 and 1/2, 4 and 1/2, 5. Jacob, Emily, 405C, 2.7. Execution, 6, 5 and 1/2, 7, 7. Synchronization, 5 and 1/2, 5, 5, 6, 5 and 1/2. Jake, Ivy, 305C, 2.8. Execution. 6, 5 and 1/2, 2 and 1/2, 3. Synchronization. 3 and 1/2, 4, 3 and 1/2, 3, 2. Reed, Catherine, 107C, 2.8. Incorrect dive. Casey, Allison, 5152B, 3.0. Execution. 5 and 1/2, 5 and 1/2, 6 and 1/2, 6 and 1/2. Synchronization. 6, 5, 5 and 1/2, 6, 5 and 1/2. Caitlin, Tom, 305C, 2.8. Execution. 2 and 1/2, 2 and 1/2, 1 and 1/2, 2. Synchronization. 2, 1 and 1/2, 1 and 1/2, 1 and 1/2, 1 and 1/2, 1 and 1/2. Lauren, Aaron, 5154B, 3.4. Execution. 7, 7, 4, 3. Synchronization. 2 and 1/2, 4 and 1/2, 4, 4 and 1/2, 3.
This concludes the mixed synchro 3-meter event. We would like to ask the top 3 place finishers to please report over by the awards podium. Divers, please hold the boards. All divers, please hold the boards. We would like to introduce the athletes for the 14-18 Synchro Girls 3-meter final. Diving first from YCF diving team, Alexandra Rosowitz and Sarah Rousseau. Diving second from the City of Midland, Logan Hillman and Charlie Campbell. Diving third from Duke Diving, Grace Cable, and from the Ohio State Diving Club, Nikki Waters. Diving fourth from SoCal Divers, Haley Montague and Marky Hopkins. Diving fifth from Trojan Dive Club, Sophia McAfee, and from the City of Midland, Taryn Gilliland. Diving next from GC Divers, Bridget O'Neill and Macy Richards. Our next team is from the Woodlands Diving Academy, Claire Andrews and Genevieve Angiorame. Diving next, Shanae Scribick and Allison Myard. From Longhorn Aquatics, Maria Coburn and Brooke Schultz. Diving next from YCF diving team, Maggie Merriman, and from SoCal Divers, Daria Lenz. Diving next from Team A&M Diving, Allison Gibson, and from Marlins Diving Club, Carolina Schulte. And our final team, our top qualifiers from this morning's preliminary, from Marlins Diving Team, Carolina Schulte, and from Alexandria Dive Club, Ann Fowler. The next event, the girls 14-18 3-meter final, will begin in 30 minutes at approximately 4:20. Again, the top 3 teams from the mixed 3-meter synchro event, please report over by the awards podium. Thank you.